Okay, your completed flow chart should look similar to this, where the characteristics for each quadrilateral is written next to its shape. I want to talk a little bit about the flow chart and what all this means. Think of this as a family tree of quadrilaterals. Okay, I'm sure in elementary you had a project where you did a family tree, where you had your grandparents, maybe great-grandparents, and your parents and your siblings. Well, think of this as a quadrilateral family tree. The quadrilaterals, there are two types of quadrilaterals. There are the trapezoids and there are the parallelograms. We're going to start with the trapezoid part of the family, side of the family. Trapezoid has exactly one pair of opposite sides that are parallel, and it stops. So you'll notice the trapezoid, there are no other family members for the trapezoids. That's because that's it. There's no place else for it to go. Then you have the parallelograms. In a parallelogram, opposite sides are congruent and parallel, and opposite angles are congruent. Trapezoids cannot be a parallelogram, and parallelogram cannot be a trapezoid because they don't have the same characteristics. The difference between the trapezoid and the parallelogram is that the parallelograms have two sides that are parallel, or two pairs of sides that are parallel, instead of the trapezoid only having one pair. So let's go ahead and talk about the parallelogram side of the family. The parallelogram has a rectangle and a rhombus. Okay, if you'll notice, the rectangle has the same characteristics as a parallelogram. Opposite sides are congruent or equal. They're also parallel. And opposite angles are congruent, meaning they're equal. Okay, so a rectangle can also be called a parallelogram. But you cannot call a parallelogram a rectangle because it's missing one of the rectangle characteristics. Can you guess which one it is? Right. In a rectangle, all the angles are right angles. They are not in a parallelogram, only in a rectangle. Same thing for a rhombus. A rhombus has the same characteristics of a parallelogram, but a parallelogram cannot be called a rhombus because there's something different. Can you figure out which characteristic is different? Right. In a parallelogram, opposite sides are congruent, whereas in a rhombus, all sides are congruent. Can a rectangle be a rhombus? No. In a rhombus, the difference between those is in a rhombus, the opposite angles are congruent, versus a rectangle, all angles are right angles. Then you have the squares. Okay, the squares can be a rhombus or they can be a rectangle. They have the characteristics of both. But they also have something different. In a square, all sides are congruent, which is the same as a rhombus. Opposite sides are parallel, which is the same for both the rectangle and rhombus. And all angles are right angles, which is the same as the rectangle. Okay, the difference between the rectangle and the square is that in a square, all sides are the same, versus in a rectangle, opposite sides are congruent. So, if you're having to name different quadrilateral shapes, and you're having to list all the names that apply, think about this flow chart, this family tree for quadrilaterals, and think about going backwards. A square, you can call it a rhombus. You can also call it a rectangle. It could also be a parallelogram. But a parallelogram cannot be a square. Parallelogram doesn't have all the characteristics that a square does. A rectangle can be called a parallelogram, but it cannot be called a square or a rhombus because it doesn't have the same characteristics as a square or a rhombus. So you're going to use this flow chart to answer your homework check questions. And you have 3 homework check questions. You have 3 figures, 3 types of quadrilaterals. You're going to list the name that applies to each, or all the names that apply to each quadrilateral. You can do this on the back of your flow chart, and you're going to turn it in tomorrow at the beginning of class. This ends your video.